Hello, everyone, and welcome to our discussion on entering vendor invoices in Design Manager. My name is Brad, and I'll be hosting the demonstration today. If you have questions during the webinar, feel free to enter them into the questions pane in your GoToWebinar panel. If the question is outside of the scope of today's discussion, please email them to support@designmanager.com. Lastly, if you missed a portion of the webinar or want to review any of our past discussions, go to our YouTube channel at Design Manager Inc., Design Manager INC, for a complete listing of all sorts of topics, including quick start videos, short helpful tutorials, and comprehensive webinars such as today's presentation under project management courses, accounting courses, weekly webinars, etc. Today we'll be discussing one of the three primary transactions for your vendors: the vendor invoices, for which you receive for completed goods and services. The other prominent vendor transactions: vendor deposits, which are prepayments to the vendor necessary for them to begin processing an order, and operating expenses, which are used to record general company expenditures such as rent or mortgage payments, phone and internet, etc., are discussed in Accounting Course 3, Managing Vendor Deposits, and Accounting Course 7, Reimbursable and Operating Expenses, respectively. Also, we will not be discussing writing and printing checks, paying vendor credit cards, etc., except for peripherally, as such procedures warrant their own discussion, and that is under Accounting Course 6, Paying Bills. So you have a vast wealth of other webinars already recorded to really deepen your Design Manager understanding. Okay, in accrual accounting, which is the recommended accounting model for interior design firms and the model Design Manager utilizes, invoices, both the invoices you generate for your client and the ones you receive from your vendors, are the driving forces behind the whole accounting model. The vendor invoice or bill you receive from the vendor for goods and services requested via purchase order traditionally is the transaction that ultimately records the costs of the purchased products into the particular projects and posts the activity on your financial statements. The vendor invoice is also the physical, fiscal, and/or conceptual representation of the transfer of ownership of the goods and services from the vendor to your company. Let's take a brief moment to explore the accounting concepts behind the vendor invoice a bit more. When we record a vendor invoice for goods, again, or services actually, on a purchase order, the cost of these goods first go into the work in process asset account. Let's jump over to our accounting tab, go to our general ledger frame, and we'll go to our accounting glossary. And there, in our case 17100, is our work in process account. Now, the work in process is an asset, as the company owns the merchandise whose work is contained in that work in process account. Think of such goods as inventory that's allocated or earmarked for a project. Owning this merchandise it increased the worth of your company. Essentially, you're moving funds from one asset, usually your checking account, into another asset account, your work in process. And if we click on our balances button, we can see there's our current work in process balance. Now, my work in process account is 17100 work in process. If you have a previous chart of accounts that you want implemented and you had a work in process account, let's say it was 1800, you could define that in Design Manager under File, Company Information and Settings. Under Company Information window, you go to your other accounts, and under your inventory accounts, again, work in process is almost like inventory, you can see how you can define what account will be used for work in process functionality in Design Manager. Now, I do highly recommend you do not change this once it has been set up originally, unless you're specifically instructed to by your accounting professional, and then it may behoove you to really contact our technical support department to walk through or at least discuss any issues in doing so. Okay, now the work in process account, if we go under our accounts payable reports down to the work in process report, this will show the activity or the actual goods themselves that's encapsulated in that work in process account. Go ahead and print our work in process report. And we can see, let's make that a little bit larger. we can see all of the components and all of their costs that are currently in work in process. And there's our 11,555 as we just saw on our balances window for our work in process account. So we can see those are completely aligned. I'm going to go ahead and add our work in process report to my favorites, as we will be jumping back to that a few times during our discussion today. Now, the cost for the goods remain in work in process until you invoice your client for the merchandise. At that moment, when the client invoice is generated, that represents the transfer of ownership of the goods from your company to the client. And at that point, the cost moves out of work in process into the appropriate cost of goods sold account. You sold it, and what is the cost? Now, for a much more detailed discussion on work in process, which is a central concept in the Design Manager accrual accounting model, be sure to take a look at our work in process webinar, also on our YouTube channel at Design Manager Inc., Design Manager INC. So once the cost leaves work in process, into which cost of goods sold account does it transfer? Well, that's determined by a combination of several functions in Design Manager: the sales category of the item, the component type itself, and in fact, even the company default cost of goods sold accounts for the appropriate component type. Now, what does all that mean? Let's take a concrete example. Let's go to our project tab, specifications. Let's go to our Hilson Pocono home. Let's take a look at our sofa here. Now notice, our sofa is assigned to the furniture cost of the furniture sales category. If we dig a little bit deeper and edit our furniture sales category, we can see the associated cost of goods sold account for merchandise is the 51,900 furniture cost of goods sold account. And if we refer back to our work in process report, we can see item 5 for our Hilson project is indeed associated with that 51,900 furniture cost of goods sold account. So there's a wide variety of ways that you can define and have Design Manager automatically fulfill what appropriate cost of goods sold account was eventually going to get affected upon invoicing the client. For more discussion on that concept, take a look at our sales category and component types explained webinar also. Okay. Now, with all of the accounting preamble behind us, let's turn our attention to the mechanics of actually recording or entering vendor invoices. Now, of course, in a real world scenario, we would first have to put our specifications in to our specification window, make our purchase orders prior to recording the bills for those goods and services. Now, again, as we have previously recorded webinars and tutorials for all of those topics, let's use some specifications and purchase orders that I've already created as examples today. Let's close a couple of these windows. Let's get ready to discuss some vendor invoices. Let's take a very simple example first. I have a purchase order for some arrowroot fabric. Let's imagine that the bill came in from the vendor, Philip Jeffries in this case, and we just want to record that for payment. Let's take a look at the purchase order itself on our purchase order window. And there it is. I have a single purchase order active for this current client, and we can see Philip Jeffries, $436. And if we look out, we see there's been no deposit information sent, and certainly no vendor invoices either. Now in Design Manager, all of the bills, invoices, deposits, operating expenses, etc., that we need to enter are done through the same familiar, convenient window. And that's on our Accounting tab, under our Accounts Payable frame, and Bills and Invoices. Basically, one-stop shopping for all of our entry from bills and invoices from our vendor. And you can see, like most of our fiscal windows in Design Manager, we have a very consistent format. A new tab for entering, well, new transactions, of course, and then we have an existing tab that lists all the previous vendor invoices, operating expenses, etc. that we've recorded for all time. And here we can review them, edit them, delete them, etc. And we'll explore some of those topics a little bit later. So back on our new tab, immediately we can see our fiscal month selection. This is into the period which the transaction would actually be posted or recorded on your financial documents, balance sheet, income statement, appropriate journals, etc. So that's quite important. And the current fiscal month is always listed for us in that top left corner. From here, we don't have many options. We can click our Add button to input our vendor invoice for Philip Jeffries. On our vendor deposit invoice and operating expense window, we use the same window to input all of these transactions. We simply indicate to Design Manager which type of entry we're currently recording. Is it a deposit? Is it an expense? Is it an invoice on a project PO? And as you become familiar with the software, I can just type I and I jump right away to that invoice for project PO. So I don't need to click the mouse and select the entry, etc. Speeds up your data entry. Now, I'm just going to go in and put in our purchase order number. Select it off our search list, and immediately a lot of the information is already populated for me. Of course, I have the vendor as Philip Jeffries, and then within the purchase order component grid, I can see the two components, the merchandise itself and the freight that was included on the purchase order. Now I just need to enter in the remaining information about the bill itself, such as the invoice number. Now that's required. So if you don't have an invoice number, you can use the purchase order number, today's date. If it was purchased online, you can use a confirmation number or something along those lines. Let's just put a fictional one in there. The invoice date, also required. And I could easily search, and let's say the bill was dated on the 26th. I could easily select that. A handy hint on dates in Design Manager. You don't need to worry about slashes or dashes or those types of things. If you want to input the date, simply type in the month, space, the day. If it's the current year, i.e. 2018 in our case, you don't even need to enter that. If you want to back post it, let's say to 2017, I would need the year as well, but 6-26 automatically defaults to 6/26/2018. So you don't need to worry about those slashes and those types of things. That leads us to the due date. Well, that was automatically supplied for us. How is that calculated? Let's take a look at our Philip Jeffries vendor on our vendor glossary. Philip Jeffries. And if we look at the defaults tab on that window, we can see my terms are net 30 with that company. So I want to ensure that I have my payments made before that designated time frame. So I set my payment due dates to 25 days. And then notice from today's date, 25 days out is indeed 7/21. Transaction descriptions, entirely optional in Design Manager, but I highly recommend them. That gives me some information of what I may have been recording weeks or even months or years ago. So just a little bit of information for my own reference in the future. And it could be as simple as final bill or arrowroot. Great. Now all the qualitative information for the bill is entered. We can turn our attention to ensuring that the cost information for the merchandise or services, as the case may be, match precisely what the vendor has actually charged us. And we do so by reviewing our purchase order components grid and the vendor invoice totals in the bottom right corner. Let's take a look at our purchase order component grid. We have a column for reference number, the unique reference number for that project, the component type, merchandise, freight, design fee, etc., the description, the catalog number, the original purchase order quantity and costs, the cost to date. That's the sum of the cost from any previously recorded vendor invoices. You can record as many vendor invoices on a purchase order as is necessary. The received column. We're tracking information such as the expected ship date, received quantity and date would be available for you here as well for your reference. Now, the quantity on invoice, which is the purchase order quantity, less any previously recorded or invoiced quantity, and the cost on invoice, which is the purchase order cost less the cost to date, are automatically defaulted for us. Essentially, that's what we're recording today. So Design Manager is trying to default what it would imagine to be the proper cost for you. Now, this is the most important point of this discussion. If we're looking at our total region and the cost on each of the components, if that does not match what is actually presented on the vendor invoice itself, we must make the appropriate changes so the amounts align. Let's imagine that the actual bill from Philip Jeffries was showing a cost of, oh, I don't know, how about $445 as the cost of perhaps both the fabric and the freight were a bit higher than we expected. Well, now we need to input those appropriate changes. So let's imagine that the cost of the fabric was $420 versus $416. To make that change, I simply click the edit button as indicated by the pencil, and I change $416 to $420. And same for the freight. Let's imagine the freight was $25. I can do the exact same and change my freight from 20 to 25. And there we go. And perhaps I want to include a note to myself. I may date the note today, and I'll say slight cost increase, designer approved, and I'll even put my initials just so we know who entered that. Now, all of my totals and the cost on each of the individual freight and merchandise match the actual vendor invoice. So we're nearly finished entering in our bill. All we need to do now is indicate how we're planning to pay, or if payment was already processed, how we did pay. And we can do so with the Pay With menu along the bottom right corner. Now, it's always going to be a selection for check. That's to indicate that you're going to be printing a check for payment. I also have a credit card account configured for American Express, and I did so under our accounting tab, our account glossary, and we can see I have an American Express account. This credit card account is a specialized type of the liability account, and that's a liability credit card, and it represents the current balance with for my company with the credit card company. As I make purchases using the credit card, the balance on the account increases. And when I pay the credit card company via an operating expense, the account balance will logically decrease. Now, for more information on the discussion of credit cards, take a look at our Setting Up and Using Credit Cards webinar, also available on our YouTube channel, and we'll go into much more discussion on those types of topics. And further, if you want some more information on other types of payment types that are available under Pay With menu, you can also review that in our Accounting Course 6, Paying Bills, where you can actually learn how to customize your Pay With options. Now, let's say that I leave it at Pay With check. Notice that we have our hand check wire transfer button available for us. And this is very handy if I paid online or any type of wire transfer, I could use that. Or if I had already written the check information, I could go ahead and enter it in retroactively. And we'll just leave ours set for a check. I'm happy that everything matches my vendor invoice, which matches the bill from Philip Jeffries precisely. And I can go ahead and click OK. Now we can see our entry on our new tab of our vendor invoice window. In the top right, we have a total purchases listed for us, which conveniently tallies all of the bills that we're entering in. As I enter multiple vendor invoices or expenses, etc., I have the ability to put them on hold. So I can actually put the bill in, but not truly post or process the vendor invoice, as we'll see momentarily. Some of our other columns available for us, we see the transaction number that'll be assigned to the vendor invoice, the type, in our case, an invoice on project purchase order, how we're paying, vendor code and name, invoice number, purchase order number, invoice and pay dates, the gross amount, any application of deposit, net amount, discount. We'll touch on that later on. If I selected to pay with our American Express, it would appear here. There's our transaction description, and I even have information if I did indicate that I paid online or used a hand check, etc. I could go ahead and continue to add as many vendor invoices as I need with the Add button. I could edit our vendor invoice if I made any changes or saw a mistake that I wanted to take care of before posting. And I could even delete an entry off of our new tab if I entered it in twice or something along those lines. The deposits and recurring button, those are going to be discussed at length in our Managing Vendor Deposits webinar and our Reimbursables and Operating Expenses webinar as well. We'll go into great detail on those two functions. We also have the ability to print a journal or a listing of all of our invoices prior to actually posting or processing them using the journal button. That gets us to our purchases posting list. Now, with posting journals, be aware that they're always defaulted to send directly to the print device. As you can see, my printing selection is pressed in or grayed out, meaning I'm going to go direct to the print device. So if I wanted to preview it on our print preview window first, be sure to uncheck that so you can have a print preview come up. You also have option to show the item detail, in other words, what items are actually on a vendor invoice or deposit, and our notes themselves. Let's go ahead and show those. And there's our purchases posting list. And obviously, most of the information is exactly as it was on our new tab of our vendor invoices window. There's our notes being shown for us. Here is the item detail, which we're showing the show item detail. We can actually see our arrow route and the freight itself. Beneath that, we have an account summary of all the accounts that are going to be affected with the transactions, and even a work in process summary in the cases of our vendor invoice posting list. So I could print that out or save it for my records. And once everything is to my liking and I'm ready to actually process the transactions into Design Manager, I go ahead and click the post button. You're always going to be asked to verify that you're ready to post. It's going to tell you the current fiscal month that's selected, so you can verify that again. And by clicking yes, Design Manager will process all of the transactions on your new tab, and then you can see them listed at the top of your existing tab, along with all of your other purchases that you've made over time. Now, while we're on our existing tab, let's take a look at some of the functions we have available for us here. As I said before, you can actually edit transactions within reason when they're on your existing tab. So if we take a look, how about this invoice for Century Furniture? Perhaps I noticed there was an incorrect cost entered. I could just use the edit button. That brings up our familiar vendor invoice window. And let's imagine that this sofa wasn't $750, it was actually $775. I could just edit, make the appropriate change. That increases all of my total information. And just like that, I've corrected the entry retroactively. Up top, I have I have two invoices for Verizon for June of 2018. Perhaps I just neglected to realize that I entered it twice. So I want to remove one of them. I can do that as well. Provided there are no checks associated with the particular invoice, I can go ahead and use the void button and simply remove or delete that vendor invoice off of our existing tab. Now, you can't edit or void an invoice, deposit, operating expense that has a check or wire transfer or certain other payment types associated with it. A Design Manager will alert you to that fact. If we look at this deposit for Gravit, for example, notice that I have a wire transfer associated with it. If I go ahead and try to void that, Design Manager is going to say, hey, I'm unable to void that vendor invoice or deposit in this case because there is a payment already associated with it. I'd have to go and void that check and then void the payable itself. So we're going to warn you and prevent you from removing or changing information that has payment already associated with it. There's also the detail button. If we select our Philip Jeffries vendor invoice and click the detail button, we can see a lot of the information that we just entered. It actually almost looks like the vendor invoice window itself. Along top, we see an account summary. The cost of both the merchandise and freight is going right into our work in process account, and the rest is going into accounts payable because we have not yet actually remitted payment for the bill. And then in our components grid, we can see the merchandise itself for the arrow route, the original purchase order cost, our actual or cost to date as we truly posted our vendor invoice, and notice we can see the difference between the two. So Design Manager allows you to check or maintain both an estimated or purchase order cost and compare it to a completely independent actual or cost to date. So you can see over time, you can analyze your true profitability, what you estimated it to be versus what it actually turned out to be. And we can even see our notes along the bottom as well. And perhaps I wanted to add a new note. Let's say on hold until cost is reviewed, BGM. So I can actually review and input additional notes on the vendor invoice from here as well. And there we go. And if we circle back to some of our other concepts so far, back to our accounts payable work in process report, well, notice we're now at, let's make that a little bit bigger. We're now at 12,025 because we have our error route and freight that we just entered in. So we're increasing that asset account because we're actually purchasing or taking ownership of that merchandise and freight. We're also going to see on our payments and checks window, here is our bill, our vendor invoice that we just entered. We haven't yet created a check or other payment for it, so it's waiting for us to do so on the payments and print checks window. And I can even hover my mouse over the notes column and see all the information that I may have entered there as well. So another way you can check or review any internal communication or notes that you may have. The payments and print checks window really goes hand in hand or corresponds ideally with another report under our accounts payable report called the aged accounts payable. And if we take a look at that report, this is a listing of all of the bills, vendor invoices, operating expenses, etc., that we've entered into Design Manager, but have not yet remitted payment for. And if we look, we can see that all of the entries on our vendor, on our payments and print checks window are exactly what we see on our accounts payable report. So those two should ideally match at all times. And just as a brief example, if we actually wanted to generate a check for Philip Jeffries, we could do so. I would just select check, hit my checks button, select the appropriate account, go ahead and print. Now there's a copy of my middle check format, whereby I have a stub at the top, stub at the bottom, and the check is in the center of the document. I, of course, would actually print this out onto the check document. And once that completes, I would go ahead and accept. And from there, we can see our Philip Jeffries entry has dropped off our payments and checks window. And correspondingly, on our accounts payable report, which will also add conveniently to our favorites, the entry is removed from there as well. Again, for a full discussion of the types and features available on our payments and print checks window, be sure to check out our Accounting Course 6, Paying Bills. And I'll go into great detail on all of the functions that you can see along the bottom of this window as well. Great, that was a very simple example. And we took our time to really explore some of the features there. So let's take some more complicated examples, and we'll try to do so and explore some even more advanced features. Let's take an example where we have a little bit of a twist. Now we have a purchase order that has a vendor deposit recorded against it, as the vendor required some initial funds prior to processing the order. Let's jump back on our purchase order window. And let's take a look at our Carter's Pennington Home project. And if we look at purchase order 7 for that project, we could see that I've indeed sent a deposit on this order, and I simply have to invoice or record the remaining invoice when it comes through. So if we go back to our accounting, pay bills and invoices, click add, invoice for project purchase order, we can select our purchase order off our list. And again, we can see all of the information recorded there for us. Let's put our invoice number in. We'll use today's date is just fine. Transaction description, final bill for wall covering. Now again, we can make any changes to the cost that we may need, but let's focus our attention on the application of the deposit in the totals region. We want to ensure that this amount is what the vendor did indeed apply to the vendor invoice we received. If we didn't, or the vendor didn't apply that deposit or a different amount, we want to edit it here to reflect the true billing scenario. So again, we're making our vendor invoice window match all the totals that are already provided for us from the vendor themselves. And let's say that we put that on our American Express in this case, and I could go ahead and hit OK and save our vendor invoice. Here's another feature. Now, we saw the OK button, which is going to save our vendor invoice on our new tab. Cancel would remove any of our changes and basically essentially delete the vendor invoice that we've in the process of entering. If I have a whole stack of bills that I'm entering, I can use the OK Add button. What this will do is simultaneously save the vendor invoice that we just recorded and keep our vendor invoice window up for rapid entry. In fact, it even leaves the same type and payment method for us. Presumably, when you're entering in all of your bills for American Express, they may be the same type, so it makes your data entry as fast as possible. If we hit cancel here, we can see, oh, there's our invoice that we actually recorded. So the OK Add allows you for really rapid data entry. Now, if we post our invoice in this case, what we won't see on our payments and checks window, we don't see that bill listed there, nor do we see it on the accounts payable report. Right? Because recall, that was purchased with our American Express credit card. We will see it on our credit card purchases report, where we can see, there it is, there's our Philip Jeffries entry. We can see the total amount, the application of the deposit for the total of $400 that we put on our American Express account. And we'd also see on another window for our credit cards and reconciliation, and there it is listed for us. So because we processed it on a credit card, it's just simply displayed in different areas throughout the software. Okay. Let's move on to another bit more complicated example. In this case, let's say that we've received a bill for only a portion of the order, which is quite common. Let's go back to our vendor invoice window, back to our new tab, click Add again, invoice on project purchase order, and let's grab our purchase order from Kravit. And notice in this case, multitude of components are listed for us. And perhaps that in this case, only the hardware and the freight for the hardware were received. So let's imagine that we don't get a invoice number. Let's just put the purchase order number in as an example. Invoice date, just use today's date again. Transaction description, let's do something final bill for hardware only. Now, clearly this doesn't represent the bill I've received from Kravit, because this represents us paying for all of the cost and freight while we only got a bill for the hardware. So I could go through, edit each entry, remove the cost, etc. But if, in this case, that's a bit of a tedious task. I can use a handy feature called the clear costs. What this will do is it's going to blank out or zero out all of the quantity and cost on invoice for me, and I can just input the amount that I need. So I'm going to click the green arrow for that function. You'll always be warned. If you click yes, notice my quantity on invoice and cost on invoice are conveniently set to 0. So now I can just go back in and put in the cost for the freight and the hardware. So I'm going to edit our decorative bracket. I'm going to slide this over a little bit for our vendor invoice distribution window so I can easily see the original cost, or I could just take it off of the bill itself. So we have 72. I'm going to use my next arrow, which gets us to our freight for 15. Merchandise of 46 for our gilded sphere. 45 for the pole. And another 15 of freight. And if I click OK, notice I've re-entered all of the costs matching the original amounts perfectly. Now, further, let's imagine clearly the vendor's not going to send me a bill for a minus 270 because I have originally have a $400 deposit on that. Let's imagine that they use none of the deposit. Well, I want to reflect that fact. I can just zero out the less deposit and depopulate the appropriate amount due. Let's imagine there's another trick to this particular order. Perhaps I have a deal where if I pay within a certain amount of days, the vendor will give me a percentage off, let's say 5%. So the discount in this case, 5% of 193 is 9.65. And let's say that if I pay within 5 days, I'll be able to utilize or realize that discount. Now, if you do have such terms with a vendor, you can streamline that process. Back on our vendor window, let's jump down to Cravat. On that defaults tab, you have the early payment discount and payment days option. So if you do have such of a relationship with the vendor, inputting it on the defaults tab will default all of that for us. Now, when the discount's entered in this manner, the project is still going to reflect the original invoice cost for the merchandise and freight, as it should. That's truly what it cost the client. The discount is recorded usually as a negative cost of goods sold entry into the designated discount account, which is also on our company information, other accounts, payable accounts, vendor discounts. And notice the 59,300 indicates that it is a cost of goods sold account, so that would be recorded as a negative. It's reducing your total cost of goods sold on a company-wide basis. Let's go ahead and click OK. Let's take a look at our journal, because I want to point out, if we look at our account summary, the full 193 is still being reflected in my accounts payable account. The discount is not being applied yet, and it shouldn't. It's only applied when the payment's made in a timely fashion. So let's go ahead and post our vendor invoice, and on our payments and checks window, for our Cravat entry, there is our discount waiting to be applied. If I go ahead and printed a check right now, it would be for an amount to pay of $183.35 versus the original amount of $193, provided I did it and dated the check within that 5-day parameter. Okay, another feature. Let's take a look at that purchase order again for Cravat. I want to show a few features here. Let's put our purchase order back in as our invoice number. Oops. And let's say this is a bit in the future, as it's another invoice coming through. Final bill for window treatment. We can see a few things here. Here's all of our hardware again. Notice now that our costs are all 0 for those products, because we've already recorded the invoice for them. So Design Manager is calculating the cost on invoice by taking the purchase order cost less any cost to date immediately to the right of it. And if I wanted to go ahead and process this, we could certainly see there's our $400 deposit still available for us. And if that's being utilized, by clicking OK, I'm being warned. Notice, I used the exact same invoice number. We used our purchase order in the last example as well. So Design Manager is simply warning us, hey, for this vendor, that purchase order has been, that invoice number has been utilized in the past. This is not an error. Design Manager is just conveniently alerting you to the fact that be sure that you actually are not entering a vendor invoice twice. Go ahead and post that. And there we go. So you can have as many vendor invoices for a particular purchase order as is necessary. Okay, let's consider another example. And let's consider secondary charges as freight as an example. Now we just saw how we had freight included on the purchase order, but that most certainly does not have to be the case. Further, let's say the vendor just charged us an even $500 of freight without showing how it was distributed to the items and components. How do we handle those situations? Let's add another invoice, and we'll get a purchase order for Legacy, and we can see we have several pieces of furniture here. Go ahead and input our invoice number information. Use today's date as the invoice date, that's just fine. Transaction description, final bill with freight. Now, I could go through and again, use our edit button and input our freight manually for each of the particular items. I don't know how it should be distributed. I could just assume, what portion of the freight went to which particular piece of furniture. But I could use another feature in Design Manager called our distribution amount. That's done by clicking the little blue and green circular arrows, which allows us to distribute an invoice cost. So I would put in the amount of freight, in our case, of 500. It is freight, but it could have been an installation charge, etc., something along those lines. Do I want to add or replace the existing amount? Well, I don't have any freight in there right now, so it doesn't matter which one I use. So I'm going to just leave it as add to existing amount. And then I have two options. Do I want to evenly split the freight? In this case, 125, if my math serves me, would go to each of the particular pieces of merchandise. Or do I want to weight it or proportionally distribute the freight? In other words, the items, the components with the higher cost get more of the freight. Let's use that as it seems a bit more accurate to me. And if we click OK, notice we're going to be warned, and our cost on invoice for each one has increased. And if we edit our dining table here, we can see we've received $271.60 out of that 500. And if we scroll through, we can see how the lower amounts get a proportionally lower portion of the freight. Another piece of information while we're here. Notice I have optional tracking information available for me here. This is convenient in two methods. One, if another team member has been inputting tracking information on the purchase order status window, it's here for my reference. But as frequently is the case, an individual who's entering in the bills may have direct contact with the vendor and are provided with some information. Let's say that the vendor not only sent over the bill via email, they said it's going to be shipped on a particular date. So I could input my expected ship date, let's say 7/10, and I could input that for each of my pieces. And if I click OK, notice the receive column now automatically updates with that information. As I said in the beginning of the demonstration, that receive column is a quick snapshot of the order tracking information to date. If we go ahead and click OK and post our vendor invoice with our distributed freight, we can see back on our project tab, purchase orders, For purchase order 8, take a look. On our receiving status window, we can see our expected ship date is here as well. So the two windows allow you to communicate back and forth as one would imagine. You're entering in a lot of information on your purchase order status window, so you want to review it for the payables team when they're entering in the bills, and vice versa. Okay. And with that, that brings us to our conclusion of today's discussion on vendor invoices and Design Manager. Now, vendor invoices are critical transactions to assure accurate accounting. Today, we reviewed most of the common scenarios in recording vendor invoices, trying to point out some handy features while doing so. I reviewed the effects on your accounting records when entering vendor invoices. I even reviewed some features in entering payments by printing checks and credit cards and those types of things. And with that, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us, and I hope that you join another of our free webinars in the near future. Thanks, and have a great day.